Not every tragedy begins with something horrific. Sometimes it starts with a decision so small that no one bothers to remember it. An impulsive trip, a late summer afternoon, a car pulling away from a familiar neighborhood, carrying 4 young people who believed they would be back in just a few days. They weren't running away, they weren't looking for danger. They simply wanted a change of scenery, something different from the same roads, the same days repeating themselves over and over. And then, at a perfectly ordinary fork in the road, they chose the path that seemed more harmless. That road had no warning signs, no barriers, no obvious reason to turn back. If you had been standing there at that moment, you would have chosen the same way. Because no one believes that a single wrong turn made in darkness and carelessness can be enough to erase 4 people from the world, silently, without witnesses, without a trace. This is not a story about crime, not a conspiracy, nor anything beyond imagination. This is a story about people, about trust in what feels familiar, and about how nature, when it is quiet, can be unimaginably cruel. Because there are places where all it takes is one wrong turn, and an entire lifetime will never find its way back. They were not famous names, not faces that were easy to remember. But because of that, they were very much like so many of us. 4 friends, all just past their early 20s. An age when life hasn't been long enough to make you afraid yet, but just long enough to make you believe that everything will work out. Among them was the one who always drove. Not because he liked being in control, but because he was careful by nature. The kind of person who checked the car before every trip, who hated being late and believed that good preparation meant fewer risks. Sitting beside him was the quietest one in the group. He spoke little, but he was always watching. He noticed small details others overlooked. Not a storyteller, but a keeper of memories. In the back seat was the one who couldn't stand silence. He talked a lot, laughed a lot, always trying to fill the empty space with stories that never quite reached an ending. For him, the journey mattered not because of the destination, but because of the feeling of being together along the way. And then there was the girl. The one who brought snacks. The one who reminded everyone to call home. The one who often acted as a bridge when personalities collided. She wasn't loud, but her presence softened everything. They had known each other for a long time. They didn't need many words to understand one another. They didn't need promises to trust. None of them thought this trip was special. Because to them, what mattered wasn't the journey itself, but the fact that they were taking it with people who felt familiar. And perhaps it was that familiarity, that ordinariness that kept them from realizing that some trips, once they begin, offer no way back. The debate began very gently. No tension, no intensity. Just a familiar question that anyone who has ever traveled has asked before: take the highway, or try the more scenic route. The highway was faster, straight, predictable, but it was also like every other trip they had taken before, nothing memorable. The scenic road was different. It wound through hills, slipped between forests and small towns they only knew from pictures. It promised something slower, more real, and it seemed to suit a trip without a plan. The driver hesitated. He was used to clear routes and easy-to-read signs. He looked at the old paper map, something he still trusted to be accurate enough. None of them were using GPS. At that time, not everyone had it. The quiet one said the road looked fine. The talkative one said slowing down didn't matter, as long as it was fun. The girl looked out the window and said the scenery was more beautiful than she had expected. No one pressured anyone. No one objected to the end. The decision was made in a very human way, a nod, a simple, let's try it. The car turned off the familiar route. There was no moment that warned them everything had changed. No sense of danger. Only a narrower, quieter road and the feeling that the trip had just become slightly different. Later, many people would return to that moment, wondering if choosing differently might have changed everything. But at the time, with sunlight still resting in the treetops and music playing in the car, no one believed this choice would become the most remembered one of all. Because some decisions, when they are made, appear completely harmless. Only much later do people understand that they were the ones that quietly changed everything. Everything, at least on the surface, was still unfolding according to plan. They stopped at a gas station less than an hour's drive from home. A perfectly ordinary stop. Too ordinary to become the final marker. The car rolled into the fuel area. A door opened. One person stepped out, another waited. No one was in a hurry. No one was tense. A receipt was printed. Clear numbers. A clear timestamp. A small slip of paper that would later become the strongest proof that they were still here, still safe, still present in the world. An old security camera captured the moment. Blurry images, faded colors, jerky movement. The kind of footage that belonged to the early 2000s. 4 people appeared in the frame, then disappeared from it, unaware that they had just stepped into the history of a case. Years later, that video would be replayed again and again. Every frame enlarged, every small movement analyzed, but nothing seemed unusual. No anxious expressions, no hurried gestures. They were just 4 young people on a road trip. Leaving the gas station, the car continued eastward. And at the same time, the phone signal began to weaken. Calls broke up. Messages were sent, then stalled, neither delivered nor failed. At that moment, it wasn't alarming. The Appalachian region was known for its dead zones. Anyone who had traveled through here knew that. They knew it too. Someone joked about how useless phones were. Someone shrugged and put theirs away. No one thought it was the first warning. The farther they went, the narrower the road became. The forest closed in. Hills began to block the sky, making the light fade earlier than usual. The radio cut in and out, then fell silent. But inside the car, there was still conversation. Still the sense of safety that comes from being together. They didn't know that what they had just left behind, the gas station, the receipt, the grainy camera footage, were the last traces the world would ever have of them. At 8:41 p.m. on a stretch of road with no clear name on the map, a call was made. It wasn't long, less than a minute. The girl was holding the phone. Her voice on the other end sounded so familiar that no one felt the need to worry. Not shaky, not rushed. No sign of fear. She said they were still driving, that the signal was very weak out there, that they might be a little lost, but it was fine. She even joked. A small, gentle joke, the kind people make to reassure those waiting at home. Then she said she would call back once they found a place to stop for the night. That was the last thing she ever said. There was no unusual goodbye, no bad feeling. Just a promise, ordinary, everyday, and easy to forget among hundreds of other calls in ordinary life. On the other end of the line, her loved ones hung up feeling reassured. They thought they only needed to wait a little longer, that the next call would come once the signal improved. But that call never came. After 8:41 p.m. that night, there were no more confirmed connections, no more messages, no more signals. Only a silence that opened slowly, quietly, and grew larger with every passing minute. Later, people would replay that moment again and again, wondering if there had been something missed in that calm, normal voice. But the truth is, there were no signs at all. Because sometimes, the final moment of a life looks exactly like every other ordinary moment. After the call at 8:41 p.m., nothing happened right away. And that was exactly why no one realized the silence had begun. At home, parents set their phones down on the table. They went on with the familiar routines of the evening. Watching television, doing the dishes, getting ready for bed. In their minds, everything was still in its normal order. Their children were away. The signal was weak. They would call back. When the night passed without another call, the first strange feeling appeared. Not sharp, just a small, unsteady shift, like waking in the middle of the night and realizing a familiar sound is missing. Someone picked up the phone and tried calling. It rang, then went to voicemail. No one panicked. They explained it away with the most reasonable possibilities. Maybe the battery was low. Maybe they were asleep. Maybe they were driving through an area with no signal. The next morning, the silence was still there. No good morning message. No call saying they had arrived safely. Now denial began to do its work. Because admitting that something was wrong meant facing a fear no one was ready to touch. Parents checked their phones more often. They watched the screen light up and go dark, again and again. Every small vibration made their hearts skip a beat. Someone started calling their friends, asking if anyone had heard anything. The answer was always the same, no. By noon, the worry could no longer stay still. It began to move through the house, from one room to another, sitting down, then standing up again. A father stepped onto the porch with his phone and tried once more. His voice struggled to stay calm, even as his hands began to shake. A mother sat in the kitchen, staring at the clock, wondering why time was moving so slowly. No one spoke the worst thought out loud, but everyone was thinking it. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It became something tangible, heavy, hard to breathe, and in that moment, without evidence, without confirmation, without a call from the police, they all began to understand some silences are not about waiting. They are the first sign that something has gone too far to ever come back. Only a silence that opened slowly, quietly, and grew larger with every passing minute. Later, people would replay that moment again and again, wondering if there had been something missed in that calm, normal voice. But the truth is, there were no signs at all. Because sometimes, the final moment of a life looks exactly like every other ordinary moment. The first call to the police was made that afternoon. Not in panic, but in a state of fear mixed with hope that everything might still be simple. On the other end of the line, the dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. They asked the familiar questions. How old were they? When was the last contact? Any history of running away? And then, as often happens, they said that adults sometimes lose contact for a few days. That mountain areas often have poor signal. That maybe they had simply stayed somewhere overnight. Those words weren't wrong. But for the family, they brought no comfort. They only stretched the waiting longer, wrapped in helplessness. When the follow-up calls were made, the voices on the line had changed, more urgent, more strained, more afraid. An official missing persons report was finally filed. No sirens, no flashing lights, none of the urgency the family had imagined. Police began with what they had: known roads, the scenic route the four friends had mentioned, gas stations, roadside shops. Patrol cars drove every stretch. Headlights swept along the shoulders. They looked for broken glass, for skid marks, for any sign that an accident had occurred. There was nothing, no abandoned vehicle, no metal fragments, no trace of a collision. Then came the hardest reality to face: the terrain. Appalachia is not like other places. Here, dense forests, steep hills, and deep ravines intertwine. There are roads once used for logging, later abandoned, never appearing on official maps. In 2004, technology was not on their side. Cell phones could not provide precise locations. Cell tower data only narrowed things down to a vast area, dozens of square kilometers, much of it inaccessible by vehicle. There was no personal GPS, no detailed digital maps, no way to see through the thick forest canopy from the air. As a result, the search was cautious. They focused on the most reasonable places. Sharp curves, stretches of road where accidents were most likely. Families stood at the edges, watching patrol cars leave and return. Each time they came back with no news, hope grew thinner. No one said it out loud, but everyone began to feel the same thing. If something had happened, it hadn't happened somewhere easy to see, and that was the moment real fear arrived. No longer vague worry, but the cold realization that somewhere in these vast mountains, an answer might exist and that no one knew where to look for it. The search had begun. But from that point on, the family understood they were entering a very long journey, one where each passing day carried no guarantee that tomorrow would be better than today. About 6 weeks after the four went missing, a small piece of information reached the police. Not a major discovery, not clear evidence, just the account of a local hunter. He said that during a trip deep into the forest, he had seen tire tracks pressed into soft ground in a place where vehicles rarely appeared, too far from the main road, too deep in the woods to be considered normal. He wasn't sure what kind of vehicle it was. He couldn't remember the exact time. He only remembered that the feeling he had when he saw those tracks was unsettling. The information was recorded, placed into the file, and stopped there. Not because no one cared, but because reality was far harsher. There were no precise coordinates, no specific time frame, no way to know whether the tracks were recent or months old. Amid hundreds of calls, hundreds of rumors, hundreds of possible directions, that clue was too thin to pull an entire search operation toward it. For the police, chasing a vague set of tire tracks through the vast Appalachian forest was like stepping into darkness without knowing what you were even looking for. But for the family, years later, that detail became another source of pain. not because they believed it was certainly the answer, but because it represented something deeply human, a moment when the truth might have been close but not clear enough to be grasped. The clue wasn't dismissed. It was simply pushed aside by time and limitations. And in missing persons cases like this, sometimes the tragedy isn't the absence of evidence, but the existence of a trace one that no one knows how to use. At the exact moment when it still mattered, time did not stop when the four disappeared. It kept moving steady, cold, indifferent, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. In the early days, the families lived in a state of waiting. They believed they just needed a little more time. A phone call, a message, a door opening late in the evening. But day after day passed, and nothing changed. Waiting slowly became routine. Phones were always set to the loudest ring. Batteries were kept fully charged. Every unfamiliar sound made hearts tighten. Then the years began to pass. One family decided to move away. Not because they had given up, but because the old house held too many memories that had never had the chance to become the past. Every corner reminded them of someone who never came back. Another family chose the opposite. They kept everything exactly the same. The bedroom untouched. Clothes left where they were. As if changing anything would mean admitting that hope had died, calls from the police became less frequent. Not because they no longer cared, but because there was nothing new to say. Even the language began to change. From might be found to if they are found. Small shifts in words, but painful enough. 7 years is long enough for people to age from waiting. Gray hair appears. Health declines. Family relationships strain not from blame, but because everyone carries grief in a different way. Hope did not disappear. It simply changed shape. It became quieter, more private, no longer spoken out loud. At some point, hope was no longer about believing they would return. It was only the wish that if some truth still existed, one day, it would be found. And through those 7 years, the most painful thing was not fear, but living inside a question with no ending. A moment when the truth might have been close, but not clear enough to be grasped. The clue wasn't dismissed. It was simply pushed aside by time and limitations. And in missing persons cases like this, sometimes the tragedy isn't the absence of evidence, but the existence of a trace one that no one knows how to use, at the exact moment when it still mattered. By 2010, the case no longer appeared on the news every day. It lay dormant in a file, classified among questions without answers, until a park ranger was assigned to review old records related to protected land in eastern Tennessee. It wasn't a glamorous task. There was no pressure to solve a case, just paperwork cross-checking maps, updating land boundaries as they had changed over time. This ranger had not been part of the 2004 search. He carried none of the exhaustion that comes from years of dead ends. He approached the files as an outsider. When he spread the newer maps across his desk, a very small feeling surfaced, not suspicion, just a slight misalignment. The scenic route the four were believed to have taken did not fully overlap with the areas that had been searched. Between the reviewed zones, there were gaps, parcels of land caught between management boundaries, belonging fully to no one. And because of that, never officially checked. He layered in additional data. More detailed topographic maps. Records of old logging roads abandoned decades earlier. Paths no longer considered roads, but still existing on the ground. Gradually, a different picture emerged. Not of where they were going, but of where they might have turned. Among the old paperwork, a brief note resurfaced. A report about tire tracks in the forest, once set aside due to lack of detail. This time, it was no longer standing alone. The ranger did not announce of a breakthrough. He did not call the families. He simply marked an area on the map, a small point. But after 7 years of silence, even that was enough to set things in motion again. In the winter of 2011, the Appalachian Mountains were nearly empty of people. Trees stood bare. Fallen leaves lay thick across the ground. Everything was quiet in the way only old forests can be. That morning, a ranger was patrolling an area of woodland closed off, because the terrain was unstable. This wasn't a place for visitors. There were no clear trails, no reason to linger, until he noticed something that didn't belong to nature. Amid the familiar curves of tree trunks and mountain rock, there were straight lines on natural angles, too clean to be random. At first, He thought it was metal left behind from the logging days. Old machinery scraps weren't uncommon in this area. But as he moved closer, something in him shifted. It wasn't just a piece of iron. It was part of a vehicle frame. The car lay far below the roadway, almost swallowed by earth, stone, tree roots, and time. It couldn't be seen from above. It couldn't be seen from the road overhead. It only revealed itself if you stood in one narrow, precise spot. The paint had faded. The body was crushed and twisted. The windows had shattered long ago, letting nature quietly move inside for 7 years. In that moment, the ranger didn't need to see the license plate. He didn't need to check a file. He knew exactly what he was looking at. A cold feeling ran down his spine, not from fear, but from the understanding that a 7-year question was lying right in front of him. He didn't touch anything. He stepped back, marked the location, made the call. The response came slowly, carefully. No sirens. No chaos, only cautious footsteps moving through the forest. When authorities reached the site, everything began to match. The model. The color. Details aligning with an old, dust-covered file. The car an entire community had once searched for. The car families had imagined in countless different scenarios. It had been here for 7 years, close enough to break your heart yet far enough that no one ever saw it. In the silent woods, the truth didn't arrive like a violent shock. It surfaced slowly, heavily, coldly. Because sometimes, the most haunting part isn't what is found but realizing it had always been there. Human beings just never stood in the one right place to see it. Once the vehicle was fully accessed, the truth began to reveal itself, piece by piece. There was no violent surprise, no sensational detail. Just a sequence of events that was deeply human, painfully ordinary, and relentlessly cruel. The road they turned onto was not a trap. It had once been a logging road, wide enough for a car. Its surface still appeared solid under the headlights. There were no warning signs, no barriers, no indication that the road would end abruptly. Ahead, the road simply broke off a steep drop plunging straight into the forest. In the darkness, there was no way to distinguish solid ground from empty space. The car didn't skid. It didn't spin. It didn't scrape a guardrail because there was no guardrail. It left the roadway at a very shallow angle and went straight down. No clear brake marks. No debris left on the road above. From the driver's position, everything happened too quickly to react. One moment, the light was swallowed. Then silence. The car didn't bounce back. It didn't stop halfway. It fell deep below, wedged among earth, rock, and tree roots. From the road above, there was nothing to see. No broken glass. No trace. Just an empty stretch of road, as if nothing had ever happened. Inside the vehicle, at least some of them were alive after the initial impact. Evidence showed attempts to escape, a door that had been opened, movements made in desperation. But the terrain offered no chance. Sheer slopes, loose soil, dense vegetation. There was no cell signal, no way to call for help, no sound that could reach the road above. Night temperatures dropped quickly. Injuries went untreated. Panic drained their strength. No villain was needed. No conspiracy required. Only an unmarked road. A moment of trust that they were still going the right way. And an environment that allowed no room for error. The accident was not loud. It left no signs for people to notice. It simply happened quietly, then left time and the forest to do the rest. And that was the truth no one saw for 7 years. After the car was found, one question immediately took hold in everyone's mind: why did it take 7 years? The answer does not lie in indifference, nor in a single mistake. It lies in the way this landscape operates quietly and without mercy. The Appalachian region does not open itself the way people expect search areas to do. It is layered, one layer stacked upon another. Ridges block valleys. Dense forest blankets everything beneath. From the air, the tree canopy forms an almost continuous surface. A car beneath it, even one only tens of meters below the road vertically, can vanish completely from view. From the road above, perspective deceives. The car left no mark on the pavement. No debris. No skid marks. Nothing to make a passing driver stop and look down. The search teams in 2004 did what was most reasonable at the time. They searched where accidents usually happen. Sharp curves. Areas with damaged guardrails. Places where a vehicle would leave obvious signs. But this accident didn't happen in a reasonable place. It happened at a point no one thought needed closer attention. On a map, the distance was small. In reality, it was separated by elevation, by trees, by a misleading angle of view. 7 years passed, and the forest kept living. Leaves fell and grew back. Branches collapsed, covering more. Soil shifted, burying what remained. The car wasn't hidden. It was simply wrapped by nature in the most natural way, and the most painful truth is this: no one was completely wrong. Everyone looked in the right places, they just never stood in the right spot. In cases like this, the truth doesn't disappear because someone conceals it. It disappears because the environment is vast enough, dense enough, patient enough to wait until humans return with a different perspective. 7 years was not a measure of neglect. It was the time it took to understand that sometimes, the answer is not far away. It is simply outside our line of sight. The calls were made quietly. No press conferences. No cameras. Just private conversations, where every word had to be chosen with care. On the other end of the line were people who had waited for this call for 7 years and others who had feared it more than anything. When they heard that the car had been found, some families felt relief as their first reaction, not because the pain disappeared, but because the waiting had finally ended. A 7-year question had, at last, found its period. Some broke down immediately. No restraint, no attempt to appear strong, as if their bodies were finally allowed to collapse after so long spent holding themselves upright with hope. But not everyone reacted that way. Some families felt anger. Anger that the car had been so close. Anger that past searches had come so near without seeing it. Anger that 7 years of life had been suspended between two possibilities. That anger had no clear target. Not the police. Not the rangers. It was aimed only at a truth that was painfully hard to accept: that everything might have ended sooner, even if the outcome would not have changed. Some fell completely silent when they heard the news. They said nothing, asked nothing. Simply set the phone down, because when the truth finally arrives, it doesn't come carrying only grief. It also brings with it the memory of 7 years of waiting. 7 years of imagining. 7 years of wondering. And in that moment, every family understood one thing: they no longer had to wait. But from then on, they would have to learn how to live with the answer they had both longed for and feared for so long. When everything was finally made clear, when the car was removed from the forest, when the file was closed, people were forced to face a truth that was deeply difficult to accept. There was no villain in this story. No one followed them. No one harmed them. No conspiracy was hidden for 7 years. There were only people. And the environment. 4 young people did what many of us have done. They trusted a road that looked safe enough. They believed that if there were danger, there would be warning signs. They believed nature was gentler than it truly is. They weren't careless. They weren't reckless. They were simply ordinary people, making an ordinary decision, in a moment when no one thought extra caution was required. And the mountains had no malice either. They didn't set traps. They didn't lure anyone in. They simply existed, vast, silent, and unwilling to adjust themselves to human expectations. In places like that, mistakes don't have to be big to be fatal. All it takes is one turn, an unmarked road. A moment of trust that you're still going the right way. This story isn't meant to plant fear. It's meant to remind us of the very real fragility of human beings when faced with the environment. That sometimes, the most dangerous thing isn't what we don't see, but what we are so familiar with that we believe it could never harm us. 7 years later, the truth was found not through luck, but through patience. Through returning to places once overlooked. Through the willingness to admit that perhaps we hadn't looked deeply enough. Those 4 friends didn't disappear because they chose to. They weren't taken by evil. They simply encountered a moment where humanity and nature were no longer on the same side. And what remains after everything is not mystery but understanding. That sometimes, life can change forever because of one very small decision in a place that felt completely familiar.